Thanks, Maggie. Well, let me just do a quick sort of remind everybody why we're here. Thank you all very much for joining us today. So this is a webinar presentation for the Land Use Intersecting Issues Working Group, and that includes members from multiple working groups of the Maine Climate Council focused on developing land use recommendations for the Climate Action Plan update. And the reason that we're focused on this issue is that the state of Maine's climate goals intersect with land use in lots of different ways. And so it made sense for us to bring members from multiple working groups together, thinking about future priority development to meet housing needs and economic opportunities that manage for reduced future transportation emissions. Also, the siting of new energy infrastructure to meet state targets and meeting these development goals while balancing our other climate goals, including local food production, protecting the state's natural working lands, carbon sequestration, and managing for climate resilience requires focus and effort. And so the presentation today is to help inform the deliberation of this Intersecting Issues Working Group. It's going to focus on some work by RMI, sharing methods and modeling, assessing the impact of local, regional, and state zoning codes to guide housing where it is most needed and most likely to reduce emissions while making other climate action investments go further. Cities and states across the US are reforming land use regulation that impedes housing production, but estimating the climate, equity, economic development, and public health impacts of those kinds of reforms is challenging, as is communicating about it in ways that speaks to the variety of stakeholders it takes to build support and successfully implement these policies. And so our presenter today, Anna Zetkulic, is an urban planner who specializes in decarbonizing transportation and building systems through location efficiency and electrification, as well as shifting public and private investments away from infrastructure that exclusively serves single passenger vehicles. She crafts and implements climate action projects and policy in partnership with mobility and housing advocates, environmental justice groups, local and state governments, financial institutions, developers, and other built environment stakeholders. And beyond assessing zoning's impact on emissions, housing affordability, and municipal income versus public service, Anna's work at RMI also focuses on expanding electric micro, shared, and commercial fleets and solving for no home charging. We've had the opportunity to talk a couple times with Anna about the work that RMI has done in this space, and I think it's going to be really, really helpful for everybody to hear some examples from their states, some policies that will inspire, I think, our deliberations, and really looking forward to the presentation today, Anna. And for folks who are observing, we are doing this as a webinar. So if you have questions, would you please put them into the Q&A chat, and we'll have some time at the end to take them. And with that, Anna, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And apologies, I know I stopped sharing my screen. My notes disappeared and I got the pinwheel again. So before I didn't want to scare anyone with the background stuff. Give me just 1 minute. It looks like it's working now. And we should be in good shape. Okay, wonderful. And now I will just share. Okay. Excellent.
That looks great.
Okay, sorry. For real this time. It's going to work, and I'm going to do this without my notes. I just want to thank Sarah, Maggie, deeply for inviting me. Really impressed with what you guys as planners and environmental advocates, environmental quality, mobility advocates. I know it's a very diverse room I'm talking to. I'm sorry I can't see your faces, but there will be time for full discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. I also have to apologize again because it is spinning wheel again. All right, I'm gonna switch to Maggie. Apologies if you wouldn't mind us going to, if you could share your screen. It's gonna lose some of the animation, but I don't want to hold this up any longer. And it's
How's that?
pending. That's great. We do see the black corners. Um,
How's that?
Perfect. Thank you. And if necessary, we can change things a bit.
Okay.
Would you mind just running through like 6 slides so I can make sure that this is the right version? Perfect. Okay, thank you. So yeah, again, thank you for having me. I'm Anna Zetkulic. I'm an urban planner. At the moment, I'm coming to you from the laundry room of my hotel in Chicago. It's the only place where they wouldn't have Taylor Swift blasting while I gave this presentation, as cool as the lobby was. Again, very glad to be here. I am from RMI. We are a think, scale, do tank based all across the world. In the US, we are in New York, DC, Oakland, California, and different parts of Colorado. We have a huge office and an awesome team based in India and China as well. And the mission of RMI is to really go where the emission and climate action potential is. How do we create a just transition that scales to the level of ambition that we need to reach to stay within a climate aligned future? If you could go to the next slide, please. So what I was going to talk today with you all about is smart growth. This is sort of a common term for developing the right way for mixed use, mixed affordability, and ability to live not entirely within a passenger vehicle, especially for families and households that don't have access to one, but are within a healthy distance of their essential destinations. At RMI, we often call it climate aligned land use, which doesn't mean anything to anyone. So I'll say smart growth for most of the time. When we coined that term, it was a way to think about where we put people, places, destinations, and how goods get to those people's places and destinations is in a way that it can be done with the least amount of emissions as necessary, can be supported with infrastructure that lets it decrease in emissions over time. So think about creating the infrastructure for electric vehicles, for walkability, for biking, at the zoomed out level of urban planning policies as well as transportation policies. Smart growth can achieve a lot of things for Maine. First and foremost among them is solving the housing crisis. I'll talk a lot about this piece of how land use both can discourage and encourage producing housing at mixed incomes, mixed types, where it is need to be, and in ways that give more agency to landowners, to renters, as well as possibly do the reverse. This is also coming back to rising costs of transportation and housing. Want to put the argument out there that where we build has just as much effect on the cost of living there as it is to get to economic opportunity. To the climate crisis, this is something that your state is at the forefront of. I've given versions of this presentation to states that ask me never to use those terms. So there's a lot of nonpartisan opportunity within using land use as a strategy for economic development, for household affordability, and for equity inclusion. Next slide, please. So this is analysis that my team led when I first joined RMI 3 years ago. Land use as a climate strategy is hard for a lot of reasons that I'll get into later in the presentation. But the real piece is, it's hard to model what the effect is going to be. Because it's this secondary piece of, okay, we know if we're going to take this many cars that currently emit this much fossil fuel and electrify them, then they will then emit this much. But land use is, okay, so what are developers actually going to do to respond to this? How fast are we going to see this change? Are people going to drive just as much, even though they now have housing closer to destinations? Which is hard to combat. So we did our first bit of modeling. And we came up with analysis that told us that if we were going to stay in a future of 1.5 degree alignment in the US, we needed to put 70 million electric vehicles on the road, excuse me, And we needed to reduce the amount we drive, vehicle miles traveled, by 20%. Sorry. Chicago, it's too clean a city. I'm from New York, so my allergies like bam as soon as I got here. I need more concrete. That figure, 70 million EVs, no one really batted an eye out. It's nowhere near the projected trajectory we're at. But very little backlash to that number. Whereas 20% vehicle miles traveled reduction, everyone was like, how the hell are you ever going to do that? VMT almost never decreases. In the best case scenario, it stays static. And we were really shocked by this piece, or at least I was as an urban planner, that nobody thought that this was an achievable goal. We did another bit of analysis that looked at that strategy in different ways, the 5 biggest policy levers. You go to the next slide, please, Sarah. Sorry, if you could go back one. All right, I think oh, it must be hidden, but I'll share later another slide that breaks out those 5 figures of congestion pricing, infrastructure changes, transportation demand management, and land use. We found that land use, especially in metro regions in the US, have the most potential vehicle miles traveled reduction, so much so that it could achieve up to 15% of a difference by 2040 compared to a business as usual development cycle, which again, people really push back on, but you know, our data was based in how a lot of cities are already doing this. I'll share this later in the presentation. Minneapolis, Portland, Oregon, Austin, Texas, with very moderate upzoning, has been able to get itself on a trajectory to a much better emissions future. There's lots of things beyond those 5 that I described, expanding highways, ending the expansion of metro highways, redesigning streets for active mobility. You can look at tree canopy and shading. There's a lot of potential for that to spur active mobility. Pedestrianizing streets, some or permanently, so some parts of the day, or creating it a permanent infrastructure opportunity, transit redesign. Again, I will mainly focus on smart growth for the rest of this presentation, but lots of slides and data behind these as well, not all of them from RMI, that I'm happy to get into. Next slide. So this is the core of the argument. And when talking about land use as a strategy to decarbonize, you really have to think of it outside of the sector. So transportation is the largest emitting sector in the US. It is decreasing at a far lower rate than all other sectors, especially electricity and buildings. And the reason for that is because we're not driving any less than we used to. In fact, we're driving more. And even though we are cleaning up how we move, we're still building cars, we're still building roadways. There's a lot of induced demand in the infrastructure we're creating to live and drive, even in electric vehicles. So we want to transition the mentality of how we decarbonize outside of sectors and to the household level. How can individuals think about their footprint, and how can governments think of consumer level emissions as impactful as decarbonizing a sector? Next slide, please. So sorry, this was the slide I meant to show, which is the deeper breakdown of those 5 strategies. And that 5 to 20% figure is a difference of 5% or more of the metro regions that have about as much housing as they're ever going to have, given there's a shrinking population. The 20% are the Austins, even the Bostons, that are seeing a lot of increase in population, but not anywhere meeting that demand with new or improved housing. So, and when I say improved, more adaptive reuse, transitioning the built environment to accommodate more residential buildings without changing the concrete footprint. Next slide, please. So these are a few climate action strategies in the US that actually do use land use as a opportunity. So first I'll say, why does land use often get left out of these? I had alluded to it a bit early on. It's really hard to measure. There's a lot of skepticism about developers responding in time to a policy, especially when we're talking about 2030 goals, 2040 goals. There's also a lot of great studies that say that that's pretty wrong. When there is demand, developers will respond quickly, but they will build where there is least blockade to that development, where the labor exists, where the supplies are there, and where there's the incentives. When are they going to see slightly more floor area ratio to provide goals in line with a state or a city? For example, 60% requirement or incentive for affordable housing within those units comes with a 20% increase in FAR. We know that in LA, that gets a really big response from developers. Part two to why land use doesn't often happen in climate action plans is it doesn't always fit within what a city county is trying to achieve. If you build a lot of housing in Austin, your emissions go up. And what you're trying to do with this climate action plan is reduce emissions. But if you don't build in Austin, then you build in a Rock Ridge right outside Austin. You have to think about the consumer and the regional level emissions if you're going to see holistic impact to climate action there. San Diego County has really embraced land use as a strategy and thought about it at the county level. City of San Diego, if they were to fit all of that new housing and it didn't happen in their wildfire urban interface, they're projecting a 2% change in their overall emissions by 2030. So that's a really fast acting change given how much development is happening. And if you completely leave it off the table, then you're not counting emissions that will increase as well, which is another lost opportunity. The big figure I'll say here is that at least in San Diego, we've modeled that moderate urban infill policies could have as much climate action power as fully electrifying all new buildings. Next slide, please. So this is a study I did with my colleague Zach Subin, who's now based out of Berkeley. We wanted to look at neighborhoods that are artificially low density. And I say artificially low density because, you know, they're connected to schools, they have public transportation, they have roads in good condition, but they're not building, even though people want to live there. And majority of the zip codes within that Black region that I'm pointing to here, where more housing could be built, are exclusionary, exclusively single family zoned. Neighbors are not all neighbors are NIMBYs, but you know, it comes down to a level of, you know, I like where I live. If I allow more development, I'm gonna see more cars on my road. I'm gonna see a lot of construction happening, and I want to maintain a current character. These neighborhoods are where there is an extra annual income of between 40 to 80,000. So higher income neighborhoods. If we just focused on trying to solve our housing shortage in these neighborhoods that are already connected to destinations with a moderate level of upzoning, we could also get to that figure of reducing emissions equivalent to fully electrifying buildings in this region. So it's a big number. It's possible. It just takes a lot of political will, community engagement, thinking about the population that doesn't live here yet. One thing I could have said on the previous slide is a lot of reasons that city councils don't touch land use is they're trying to keep a current population happy. They're not representing a population that could live here in 20 years. So the conversation really has to be, no, I don't want to see this here, but yes, I want to see something that allows my children to live here in 20 or 30 years. And that does require some level of policy that incentivizes that change. Next slide, please. So this is some modeling looking at a whole system strategy for delivering emissions reduction. Transportation pollution reduction pathways in the gigatons, that 3 gigatons less of CO2 nationally. This is totally possible with a current EV adoption scenario, as well as a reduction of business as usual VMT. This is a national study. It's behind this is a tool that we created called the Smarter Modes Calculator. I'll share at the end of the presentation a link to that tool. Maine is one of the states that are pre-populated in it. We have all 48 continental states. That shows what, if you at a state level could achieve the 90th percentile of your current VMT rate. So it's not assuming that, Portland, Maine becomes Portland, Oregon. It instead assumes that Bangor, Maine could become the VMT rate of Portland, Maine. So that totally in the political possibility of creating that level and achieving those goals. If we did this at the national level, so this also makes assumptions that in North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina is getting to a VMT rate equivalent to Asheville, North Carolina, that has a really low VMT because it's very walkable. We could see 3 gigatons less of CO2. Apologies, this is bad presentation skills to put a lot of data in one slide with one map. But essentially what this is saying is if we were able to get at the best, close to the best scenario for VMT reduction in our states, we could have the equivalent of taking 8,000 natural gas-fired plants offline per year, or we could be reducing the amount of carbon as gets sequestered in 3.5 billion acres of forests. So it's kind of like doubling our forest coverage. Next slide, please. So I've been talking about land use reform without telling you exactly what it is. And I know a lot of you are pretty versed in this. And apologies, I'm going to switch my view to stand. Shout out to St. Louis City Museum. If you have kids or you just like cities, please make a visit to St. Louis. They gave me this shirt for coming and presenting last week. So land use reform can look like a lot of different things. I showed that big list of policies for tackling transportation emissions. The land use reform scenarios, the smart growth scenarios, come down to 3 simple things. Upzoning, so allowing more parcels on already developed land to change a use that is fitting current needs. So that might look like we have a lot of commercial space, we have a lot of vacant big box stores. These are really good opportunities for changing the zoning code to allow mixed housing or to allow denser housing. I'll talk about Minneapolis a bit. They've really seen a huge developer response, not so much because they've upzoned universally their city to triplexes, but they upzoned their underutilized commercial spaces to allow apartment buildings. That's really been the big chunk of how they've achieved their housing affordability and housing production goals. Infill and redevelopment. So some upzoning also means infill and redevelopment. Some infill involves zoning. This just means that we're looking at underutilized spaces and allowing development. Sometimes that requires a policy change. Often it really doesn't. You just have to tell developers that they can do it. Lots of different cities and counties have changed their codes to design-based codes or released different built environment plans for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, or for single-family homes, where you basically don't have to go through the permitting process anymore if you design to this this design code. And you've taken a huge chunk of that costs and time to the development out and incentivize that redevelopment. Essentially, all the developer then has to do is require the land. If they already acquire the land and they're building to that spec, it's by right development. And then transit-oriented development. The next few slides, I'll be showing a few different scenarios that are very baked in TOD. If you're going after emissions reduction, you have to have some level of policy that is thinking about how people will move when this development comes online. Next slide, please. So this is a study that my team produced last year. Well, we released it last year. It took us about a year to do because we had a big stakeholder engagement piece to this work. We wanted to model what development could possibly look like for some moderate level upzoning in 3 rapidly growing metro regions. And you can get similar findings to what's shown on the slide. Again, there's a lot of analysis behind this and not being told with this one slide, mostly to not overwhelm you and hope that you download the paper. But it is achievable in a place like Portland, Maine, that does have a level of growth, isn't at the extreme level of a Denver, Charlotte, or Austin, but there are also really considerable savings with a moderate level of upzoning. We took a tool called Urban Footprint. We modeled how much development currently exists in each of these 3 metro regions, created a business as usual scenario. I'll just go, if you, Maggie, could go to the next slide real fast. This is that business as usual scenario for Austin. All of that yellow is currently single family residential. It is plenty of rural land within there, a lot of parcels that farmers have been selling off to developers because they're not getting a return on their investment from producing on the land anymore. Because Austin is really, well, okay, Austin's not on the call. So Austin has tried to reform their land use, their zoning for a better part of 15 years. And have done a lot of good things, have garnered a lot of lessons learned. There is a lot of tension between existing homeowners that are lower income as well, because they've seen upzoning happen on some parcels, but they've only been luxury townhomes or luxury apartment buildings. They're really feeling the pricing surge in Austin. Many of them are selling off their land because they just can't afford to live in the city at the moment. Sorry, to continue living in the city, given the tax base, the rise in taxes, but they don't want to move. So they are getting pushed out into the suburbs, seeing their household income benefit from that initial sale. But now especially if they're still working in Austin, they're spending a lot on their transportation. And this is basically an urban sprawl scenario. Maggie, if you wouldn't, I'll share at the end, because I don't have the animation, sorry, that last slide is not showing the land use or the climate aligned land use scenario. I'll share that at the end. But it essentially shows most of that yellow area, well, not about 60% of that yellow area goes to pink, and in the center of Austin. What we're showing here is with a transit-oriented development strategy that sees current big box stores upzoned for apartment buildings, and then exclusively single family neighborhoods going up to a triplex by right. We put that on a 90th percentile of changing growth. Not all of this is going to upzone overnight. One would really hope that wasn't the case too. But there will be some level of development, and what it achieves by 2045 is all of its metro planning organization, which is called Cap Metro in Austin, achieves its decarbonization goals with a TOD strategy alone. So that means a lot of things. One is that all the investments that the city is putting in through a project called Project Connect to allow better transportation options within the city of Austin is that much more effective. It's got increased ridership. Its electrification goals are that much easier because people are moving less, so they don't have as much demand on their grid as they're electrifying. It creates a positive cycle of better growth. And what you'll see on the side are some pretty big numbers for household energy savings, water savings, that preserve carbon sequestration potential. That's a huge number because we're not seeing such a high rate of agricultural land being turned over for development. Next slide, please. This is just to show what Project Connect looks like through this changed corridor projection. So everything in pink is now much more supported by frequent transportation, given their current investments. If we were to use these corridors to centralize the majority of new housing, we could see close to a million units fitting within Austin without drastically changing its urban character. again, bad presentation skills. That's a lot of data on one slide that let's not get into, unless you want a good debate afterwards. I presented that in Austin, and I didn't get much farther than that slide in the discussion. This is also what that looks like on an even smaller scale, which is one urban corridor that is mostly surplus parking, a lot of Kmart kind of style buildings where there's more parking than it certainly needs in terms of demand, allowing up to 6-level apartment buildings on this stretch of corridor, which is about 5 miles, could achieve 60,000 new units as well. Next slide, please. So this is kind of everything that I'm saying in these slides. I really only presented data at this point, and I've made it sound like it was pretty easy. It's not. There's a reason we have a pattern of sprawl in the US, and that's because there's a lot of things that happen to lock in these choices. There's a lot of community engagement that has to happen to support a shift in, well, how we think about urban planning. It requires a real change management strategy, to use some gross consultancy terms that I was told is a good term to use out there when talking about land use. But essentially here, what I want to get out here is, for the rest of the presentation, I'll talk a bit about what it takes to achieve land use reform, and how to do it so that it creates more co-benefits, really thinking about a reduction in vehicle miles traveled, but also an increase in household affordability to live in the places we want to live in. And to think about this in terms of, you know, it takes a lot of political capital to do one land use reform policy. You have to engage with a lot of people on the ground. You have to build on existing momentum. You've got to have the political window, and you've got to have a champion within government. To some extent, you need analysis. You need to be able to arm advocates with a level of trust that these policies will see change. And you guys are decision makers and policy makers. You've worked within this wheel for a lot of different things. Land use isn't that much different, other than it often is a bit more controversial than other transportation focused and housing focused policies. We can debate that one too once I let you guys talk. No one's allowed to yet, right? Next slide, please. Maggie, thank you. So this is just some numbers for what is the level of housing shortage in the US right now. We currently have about 85 million single family homes in the US, 31 million multifamily homes. We're thinking that we have a shortage of 5 million in total. So if we're gonna make up the difference of that balance, we need housing. We need to produce housing. That does not necessarily mean that we're turning over our forests and agricultural lands, even though greenfield development is often the cheapest way to build, and those savings fall eventually onto the consumer and the renter. But we don't have that land to give as much anymore. So we really have to think strategically about where we build, where we're creating affordability and a tax base, where does the stormwater, the electricity, the grid already allow for this change, especially because we don't want to lose the value and the biodiversity where we haven't developed yet. And this is something, Maine has really led in this space for a while compared to other states. Next slide, please. So talking about what does land use change mean in terms of housing, and where is the opportunity, both market opportunity and household affordability. First and foremost, it's with homeowners. Plenty of single family homeowners would love to redevelop, to create an accessory dwelling unit that gives them more space, that potentially gives them additional income. There's a lot of ways to go just from single family to duplex without changing the amount of stormwater that the building needs, and then making the most of that lot size. And in the back, I'm just showing a 15-minute neighborhood annex, which is really useful for thinking about where walkability already exists by zip code. And I'll share a link to that later too. Next slide, please. There's also a lot of potential for incremental mid-size home builders. This is a big part of my research, which is thinking about where's the economy of scale for land use reform and infill, especially because most builders are, well, there's a figure from the Kennedy School that suggests that 90% of new building is happening by two developers. Sorry, 90% of the new development is happening by the 10 biggest builders in the US. Of that, 20% is happening from just those two builders. It's not 20%, it's 80%. So a huge amount of building being happened from very big companies. Apologies, I'm not reading off the notes. I'm getting that one a little wrong. But the takeaway here is those developers aren't really going after infill. There is a real equity component to allowing smaller builders, which have a higher rate of being women-owned, BIPOC-owned, community-led, community land trusts, to be able to make profit off of infill development, because they're working at a much more smaller economy of scale. And if they can accrue just a few plots of land, they get more bang for their buck when they're able to produce more on it. They're not thinking about like the multi-acre site as much as an R. Horton or a much bigger developer would be. Next slide, please. Okay, water break. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left till we'll be ready to transition to the questions.
Thank you. I'm gonna, this is just to say there's also a lot of potential for national home builders to get into the game if they think about their apartment buildings as more creating a mix of amenities. Next slide, please. So what does it take to enable inclusive climate aligned housing through land use reform? You need the data to be able to show that this policy is going to achieve the co-benefits you're looking for. This is a visual from Desegregate Connecticut's zoning atlas, which does that. The real tool behind this data was showing just how much of the land in the state of Connecticut was exclusively zoned for single family housing, and making that the point of contention for policymakers to appreciate not building here is preventing affordability at the statewide level. Often we think of zoning as small, very small jurisdictions, but they have regional impacts. You have to think about the policy in a lot of integrated ways. That means land use has to happen. Land use policy has to happen in climate policies. Climate policies have to be built into housing policies. You want to see the change in terms of design. This is a picture from Low-Rise Housing Ideas for Los Angeles. This is a lot of community designers showing what accessory dwelling units would look like on a street, making it more of a, yes, I want to see this in my neighborhood, as opposed to, no, don't want to see a change. And you need diverse coalitions. We'll run through the next few slides. Sorry, I'll just stop here for a second. So who's doing this? Utah. This is a mountain state that has been able to pass lower parking minimums, convert unused retail to mixed use near transit corridors, universal ADUs. This was a bipartisan bill that has had a lot of impact in terms of new developments, especially where there's a lot of water constraints in Utah. Next slide, please. Connecticut has been able to mobilize their Desegregate Connecticut coalition to allow ADUs by right, changing the minimum lot size. So this helps pencil out for developers a better return on investment for adding ADUs. Next slide, please. Washington has just come out of its year of housing policies. This has been a lot of upzoning by right. all residential zones within a quarter mile of walking distance have to meet these goals. So really making the most of, if you're going to be a transit node, you have to be building enough to respond to that climate and affordability opportunity. Next slide, please. So Montana, unfortunately, all of these policies are currently on hold with a judge, but we think they likely will go back on the books. This was a really cool language for its upzoning. They called it eliminating California zoning in Montana. Really messaged it as restoring landowners' rights to build affordable starter homes. So yeah, kind of a libertarian argument that really resonated with a lot of different coalitions. There is a law on Montana's books to prevent climate from ever being said in in legislative action. This was not a climate bill. This was about creating housing and not losing agricultural land because we're not building enough within Montana's metro regions. So again, it's currently on hold, but it likely will be back on the books. The projection is early next year. And yeah, just a mix of other transportation bills that will also achieve smart growth strategies. Maggie, I think let's stop there. I know I have lots of other slides that I intend to give as kind of talking points outside of this land use discussion. They're more about flexing transportation dollars and using IJA and IRA funds. I think it's better to let that be another presentation, but I will give the slides.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really helpful. We do have a question and answer box that anyone that is listening wants to put a question or comment into, they can. We do have one here for a starter. And I know Anna said she can share her resources for any additional questions that come in. So the first question is, a lot of the strategies and case studies being discussed seem most applicable to urbanized areas. Are there particular strategies or case studies that are applicable to rural communities?
Yes, the Washington bills are actually really great mix of policies that look at a lot of western parts of the state. So it's not just Spokane. There really aren't a lot of cities that are happening in western Washington, like compared to Seattle, Tacoma area by population size, but they're feeling a lot of stress to upzone ahead of what they think is going to be a bigger movement of people from the metro regions to those cities. Austin has a tiny city outside of it called Bend, I believe, where they switched to a design-based code, anticipating that they were going to see a lot of the pressure happening in Round Rock and Austin for new housing. They didn't want to completely convert their agricultural land to townhomes, but right now there's a big developer move. Thinking about this ahead, really investing in the main street where you want people to go to anyway, where there's probably an existing kind of places of interest, a community diner, a community center, churches, making housing happen around there, and then creating the transportation investments that are going to support those who live outside of that main street to reach it. There's a lot of ways to make it pencil out. Paratransit, micro-mobility options. Everyone hates e-scooters on sidewalks, but they do a lot for climate action and creating affordability and access for last and first mile transit. But it has to be thought of holistically. And you have to, pilot and fail. And unfortunately, that also costs money, but nobody gets it right the first try.
Thank you. Next question. In Maine, transportation policy feels very separate from policy on climate change and housing. Are there examples of other states where these policy areas are aligned and work together?
Yes. Could you, Maggie, go through a bunch of slides, unfortunately, to get to the Minnesota one? Yeah, sorry, one back. Yeah, so Minnesota got a great policy on the books last year called 2887. It locks in a new funding source for Minnesota's transportation investments. The real thing that this achieved was forcing Department of Transportation of Minnesota to look at the climate impact of where it invests. And essentially that means if you're going to build a new highway, you really have to show what it's going to mean in terms of the embodied carbon of that concrete, inducing increased travel, how long it'll take before that congestion relief cancels itself out, and you just see as many cars on the road you've increased the number of cars on the road, congestion is back. You know, that often happens within just 7 years for big highway changes. So yeah, my takeaway here is you have to look at the money. How much are we spending on big infrastructure? And that's just gonna, in the future, increase our emissions. And where else could that money go? Like a lot of federal funding, you know, it's within parameters. So these are highway bills. They don't necessarily mean that you have to spend them on new highways. You can improve what's in place. You can flex some of it to be about, especially with the planning dollars, thinking about what new housing here would mean instead of a new highway line. In terms of reducing the level of service and kind of all the language that DOTs are thinking in. That was a bit of a ramble, but yeah, I'll cop out. It's about money, so let's put money towards climate action, and not just this, and think about a fix it first mentality for our roadways.
Great. Another question here. Do you have ways to quantify the emissions benefits of individual land use policy choices?
Yeah, everybody wants this. I want it too. The caveat I'll put here is, yes, it's really powerful to be able to show, all right, if we're just gonna have enough political will to end parking minimums in the state, let's do that. And then this is what we're gonna create in terms of emission reduction. Unfortunately, and this is a bit of a cop out, like you need to do a mixed bag of lots of things to see that change. In Minneapolis, they ended exclusively single family zones, upzoned everything to a triplex, and went about 2 years before they really saw any change in what was being their excuse me sorry, their planning permitting process. And their own conclusion was that they weren't doing enough. They needed to also look at parking requirements. They needed to also look at minimum lot sizes. They needed to upzone a lot on their commercial corridors. And that's what really in combination made that change. So it's so hard to be able to model front end what one thing is going to do when it takes a lot of things happening at once to see the change. Montana's bills really show there's something like 7 policies they put on the books that look at lot sizes, that look at affordable housing requirements, that put some bans on different types of development, which, you know, is a kind of a dirty word for them, but they made it in the context of protecting the wildlife urban interface. They made it, they do really small things too, like a homeowners association can't question a development that isn't going to change the stormwater access. There's all these little barriers to climate aligned housing that have to be done to see a bigger change. So yeah, no, but maybe you can. We wanted to do this for a long time as an institute. No funders got enough money to make it happen. Or no funder seems to care enough. Everybody wants to fund transportation electrification studies. Land use is always a little, yep, we'll see.
Great. Next question. You see many examples of where land use policy slash zoning is unleashing new ways of building. For example, new materials or new methods of construction.
Yeah, I went over it really quickly, but the Low Rise LA design competition was a really cool example of a city getting a chief design officer for the first time in its history, having a champion who knew that California was going to have a lot of big legislation affecting LA, knew that there was going to be challenges politically at the local levels, and a lot of the California bills are being challenged by local advocates, regional associations, homeowners. But to get in front of that, they wanted to create a design opportunity that showed that change from, all right, what is everything you also want to see happen in this neighborhood? I want to see better building quality. I want to see more affordability and rental options. I want to see adaptive reuse. So they put it with the designers to, all right, here's the policy change. You now have this many houses on this street as opposed to what's currently zoned. What can that look like in terms of materials and green space and leveraging a newer tax base? So we want to see mixed of housing. So it's there are some wealthier people coming in being taxed a little bit higher. That revenue should go back into the community, and we should see places for young people. It really changes the narrative that often happens with land use reform of, all right, it's currently exclusively single family zoned. We're now allowing ADUs by right. It's super easy if you're a homeowner to say no to that. It's a lot harder to say no to, I want to see better green space on my street. Apologies. I the problem with the laundry room, but I've been lucky for the first hour. Yes, I want my kids to be able to afford to live here in 10, 20 years. Plenty of these homeowners know that given the amount of income they had at the time that they got into their neighborhood, they could not live here now. So you have to take people outside of themselves a little bit and think about that future. And luckily in Maine, you've got real strong climate advocates who just need to see housing and land use as achieving their co-benefits and their long-term affordability and access.
Thank you, Anna. I appreciate that you mentioned that communications piece because I know we've been noting that as well as an important tool. We do have one more question here I think we have time for. Transit-oriented development is an important consideration for Maine. However, don't have a lot of transit services relative to more urbanized areas. We are a pretty rural state. How can we encourage transit expansion slash increased regularity of service alongside development of new dense housing?
Yeah, if you could go back like 2 or 3 slides, Maggie, to sorry, one more. Sorry, I went too far on. I think you're like 2 seconds ahead of me. If you could go backwards.
Backwards. Oops.
It should say Colorado at the top.
There we go.
Okay, yeah. So Colorado has done actually kind of in the wake of not being able to get the housing production bills that they wanted, focused on their transportation investments, created e-bike subsidies that are really supporting connecting people to public transportation. They're not taking people out of public transportation. Their current data is really showing that they're replacing car trips, not public transportation frequency. They're working with, they're creating contracts for different providers like Lyft and Bird to create a revenue that's going straight back into improving service, making it free for anyone who's on income supportive services like food stamps or housing vouchers to use those mobility options. they're starting at the micro level and trying to expand there, create new revenue for shared transportation, at the same time that they're going to be producing housing in better places, mostly through incentives because they haven't been able to go through the route of requirements. And it's a good stopgap for starting that change now. And happy, Josh, to create a communication line with some of the advocates that have supported these bills between Maine and Colorado.
Awesome. Anna, thank you so much. And especially appreciate the logistical challenges of delivering a presentation from a laundry room. So thank you for taking the time today and I really want to say thank you for you putting together this presentation for us. I know sort of grabbing different aspects of work that you've done and compiling it in a set of resources that make sense for Maine. Really appreciate your time doing that. So I just wanted to let everyone know we'll post the slides from this presentation. We'll post the video recording. The next meeting of the land use group is not until June 10th. So please take a minute to kind of look through some of these resources that Anna has provided, and looking forward to diving into the details with all of you in a couple of weeks. Anna, any final words for us before we wrap up?
Well, just thank you again so much for having me, for talking about housing and land use in the context of climate. I think I hopefully wasn't too snarky when I said I've sometimes given versions of this presentation and I don't talk about climate and environmental justice, but this is a bipartisan issue. It achieves a lot for a lot of different people. That doesn't mean it isn't hard. So thank you guys for just talking about it. Frankly, there are plenty of states that keep this off their radar because they think it's too hard to do, or because they're thinking in terms of the next election. Yeah, just kudos, guys.
All
Thank you
right.
so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Maggie. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.